In the heart of Ridgefield, Oregon, a small town nestled between dense forests and shrouded in an almost perpetual gray sky, life moved at a slow, predictable pace. The townsfolk prided themselves on their close-knit community, where no secret remained buried for long. Or so they thought. David Walker, Ridgefield's undertaker, was a man who epitomized reliability. For over 3 decades, he had quietly managed the family-run funeral home, preparing the dead with care and precision. The townspeople respected him, even trusted him with their most vulnerable moments, the loss of their loved ones. With his calm demeanor and measured voice, David exuded the kind of steadiness people clung to in times of grief. No one questioned his methods. No one ever doubted him. But beneath the surface of this unassuming man lay a darkness so profound it would shatter Ridgefield's fragile sense of security. On the morning of February 15, 2020, the town awoke to an unthinkable revelation. David Walker, the man they had trusted for years, had been arrested. The accusations were grotesque, unimaginable: abuse of the dead, desecration of bodies, and an even more sinister connection to the mysterious death of his wife, Margaret Walker, just days earlier. Whispers spread like wildfire. How could such a thing be true? How could a man like David harbor such horrors within him? Margaret Walker, David's wife of 25 years, had been a quiet, unassuming presence in Ridgefield. She was known for her kind smile and her unwavering devotion to her husband. In recent months, however, Margaret had become a shadow of herself. Her health had begun to decline sharply in early 2019, with doctors baffled by a mysterious bacterial infection that defied all treatments. David, by all appearances, had been a devoted husband, spending countless hours by her side as her condition worsened. But even as Margaret grew weaker, the distance between them seemed to widen in ways only she noticed. Neighbors had started to talk, though always in hushed tones. They had seen David working late into the night at the funeral home, his face drawn and weary. Some wondered if the stress of Margaret's illness had taken a toll on him. Others dismissed their observations as nothing more than the musings of a small town with too little to talk about. What no one could have imagined, not even Margaret in her darkest moments of suspicion, was the truth that would soon come to light. On the surface, Ridgefield remained calm, its streets quiet, its residents moving through their daily routines. But an unease had begun to settle over the town, a gnawing sense that something was terribly wrong. It was the kind of quiet that came before a storm, when the air felt heavy, and the shadows stretched just a little longer than they should. For years, David Walker had been a pillar of the community, the man who helped families say their final goodbyes with dignity and care. No one could have guessed that he was hiding a secret so vile it would leave Ridgefield reeling for years to come. The cracks in David's perfect facade had only just begun to show. Behind the closed doors of the Walker household, the picture of a perfect marriage was beginning to fray. Margaret Walker had always been proud of the life she and David had built together. Their marriage, spanning more than 25 years, was marked by a quiet sense of companionship that she once believed was unshakable. But over time, Margaret had started to sense a change, subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. David had always been a reserved man, but lately, his distance felt different. He spent long hours at the funeral home, often coming home well past dinner. When he did return, he was distracted, almost detached, answering her questions with curt nods or vague responses. The warmth in his eyes, the one that had comforted her through countless sleepless nights, seemed to have dimmed, replaced by something she couldn't quite name, an emptiness, or perhaps, a carefully concealed burden. Margaret tried to push aside her concerns. She told herself that David was simply stressed. After all, running the funeral home wasn't just a job, it was a calling, and the emotional weight of dealing with grief daily was bound to take its toll. But as the months passed, her excuses felt thinner, flimsier, as the gap between them grew wider. It wasn't just his absence that unsettled her, it was the small, peculiar details that she couldn't ignore. His clothes often carried an odd, faint smell, earthy, almost metallic, that lingered even after she washed them. There were late nights when she would hear him pacing in his office downstairs, his footsteps heavy and erratic, as if he were wrestling with some invisible demon. On more than one occasion, she caught him staring blankly at nothing, his hands trembling ever so slightly. When she pressed him about it, he would shake his head, offer a weak smile, and assure her that he was fine. But Margaret knew better. She had always been able to read David, even when he tried to hide his feelings. And what she saw in him now scared her. Her instincts told her that something was wrong, terribly, irreparably wrong. She tried to bridge the distance between them, to draw him out of whatever darkness had taken hold of him. She would bring him his favorite meals to the funeral home, ask him to join her for a walk, or reminisce about their early years together, hoping to spark some flicker of connection. But each time, her efforts were met with the same polite indifference. David was there, but not truly present. As the months turned into years, Margaret began to doubt herself. Perhaps she was imagining things. Perhaps her own health struggles were clouding her judgment. By early 2019, her body had begun to betray her. The fatigue that crept in during the evenings became a constant companion. Fevers came and went, leaving her weaker each time. Her once healthy appetite dwindled, and the vibrant woman who had once lit up every room she entered now spent most of her days confined to bed. David's behavior, too, shifted in strange ways. While he remained attentive on the surface, bringing her tea, ensuring she made it to her doctor's appointments, there was an odd detachment in his care. It was as if he were performing a role, checking off a list of duties, rather than genuinely connecting with her. Margaret felt like a ghost in her own home, a haunting presence that David could no longer bear to confront. Then there were the moments that she couldn't explain, the ones that made her stomach knot with unease. One evening, as she folded David's laundry, her fingers brushed against a small, unmarked vial tucked into his shirt pocket. The liquid inside was cloudy, and when she asked him about it, his face paled for just a moment before he quickly dismissed it as a cleaning solution he used at work. But his answer didn't sit right with her. There was a flicker of something in his eyes, fear, maybe, or guilt. Margaret kept the vial, hiding it away in her bedside drawer. She wasn't sure why she did it. Perhaps she thought she would find some use for it later, or perhaps it was her way of holding onto a piece of the puzzle she was too afraid to solve. Despite her mounting suspicions, Margaret never confronted David outright. She told herself she needed more evidence, that she couldn't accuse him of something without proof. But deep down, she knew the truth, she was terrified of what she might uncover. After all, David Walker wasn't just her husband, he was the man she had trusted with her heart, her home, her life. And if he was capable of hiding something from her, what else might he be capable of? For now, Margaret kept her silence, hoping that she was wrong, that whatever was happening to David, and to their marriage, was temporary. But in the quiet corners of her mind, a darker thought began to take root. What if David's secrets were not just his own? What if, in some unthinkable way, they were beginning to consume her too? To the people of Ridgefield, David Walker was the embodiment of reliability and dignity. As the town's undertaker, he had spent over 3 decades quietly preparing the dead for their final farewells, offering grieving families solace in their darkest hours. His work was meticulous, his demeanor calm, and his reputation impeccable. But what Ridgefield didn't know, what no one could have imagined, was the secret life David led behind the polished facade of professionalism. David's obsession with death had not begun with malice. It started innocently enough, as a fascination with the stillness of the human body in death. When he first took over the family funeral home, he saw his work as a calling, a chance to offer peace and closure to families in pain. The solitude of his job suited him, he had always preferred the quiet over the chaos of the living. But over time, that quiet began to whisper to him, pulling him toward thoughts he struggled to suppress. At first, those thoughts were fleeting, curiosities about the lives of the people whose bodies he prepared. Who were they? What stories did they leave behind? But as the years passed, those questions morphed into something darker. The stillness that had once comforted him now stirred an inexplicable urge, a compulsion he couldn't name. He found himself lingering too long in the embalming room, his gaze lingering on the lifeless forms before him. David tried to rationalize it. He told himself it was stress, exhaustion from the long hours and emotional weight of his work. He convinced himself that these thoughts were harmless, that they didn't define him. But deep down, he knew better. There was a darkness growing inside him, one he could no longer ignore. By the mid-2000s, David's curiosity had evolved into action. It started small, harmless, he told himself. He would take photographs of the bodies, ostensibly for documentation purposes, but his true motivations were far more sinister. The act of capturing their lifeless forms gave him a sense of control, a power he couldn't find elsewhere. It was a secret he carried alone, buried beneath layers of careful lies and half-truths. As his obsession deepened, so did his precautions. He created a meticulous system to hide his actions, ensuring that no trace of his compulsions would ever be found. The basement of the funeral home became his sanctuary, a place where he could indulge his urges without fear of discovery. Every tool, every action, was calculated. He was careful not to leave a single mark, not to allow any mistake that might betray him. Yet even in his darkest moments, David wrestled with guilt. He hated himself for what he had become, for the ways his secret life had begun to seep into his marriage, his home. Margaret's growing illness only compounded his torment. He would sit by her bedside, holding her hand as she slept, and wonder if the bacteria that ravaged her body had come from him, from the world he had built in the shadows. He told himself it wasn't possible, that her illness was a cruel twist of fate, unconnected to his actions. But the doubt gnawed at him, a relentless reminder of the line he had crossed. There were moments when David thought about stopping, about confessing to someone, anyone, and seeking help. On one particularly sleepless night, he even considered turning himself in. He sat in his office, staring at the phone, his hand hovering over the receiver. But fear held him back. Fear of losing everything he had built, of being exposed for what he truly was. So he buried the thought, just as he had buried so many others, and carried on. By the time Margaret's condition began to worsen, David's life had become a delicate balancing act. To the outside world, he was the devoted husband, the dependable undertaker. But in the privacy of the funeral home, he was something else entirely, a man consumed by desires he couldn't control, haunted by the choices he had made. The more he indulged his compulsions, the more reckless he became. He told himself he was careful, that no one would ever suspect him. But cracks were beginning to show. His late nights at the funeral home drew whispers from the townspeople. Margaret's quiet observations, his trembling hands, the strange smells on his clothes, were piling up in ways he couldn't entirely dismiss. And then there was Aaron, the new part-time employee, whose curiosity was both a blessing and a threat. David knew the walls around his secret life were beginning to close in. But he told himself he could maintain control. After all, he had kept his secrets hidden for years. What was one more night? One more indulgence? He convinced himself that no one would ever find out, that he could balance the two lives he led indefinitely. But David was wrong. And the price of that miscalculation would be catastrophic. Margaret Walker had always been a woman of quiet strength, the type of person whose presence brought calm to those around her. Her laugh, though soft, had a warmth that lingered in the hearts of those who heard it. But by the start of 2019, that warmth had begun to fade. The woman who had once hosted lively dinners and brightened Ridgefield's community events was now confined to the dim corners of her own home, her health failing in ways no one could explain. It started with fatigue. Margaret brushed it off at first, blaming it on the long winter or the stress of running a household while David spent late nights at the funeral home. But the fatigue didn't pass. Soon, it was accompanied by fevered nights that left her sheets drenched in sweat. When the fever subsided, there came an unrelenting ache in her joints and a weakness in her muscles that made even climbing the stairs a struggle. David, ever the picture of devotion, urged her to see a doctor. Margaret relented, though she felt a pang of guilt. She hated to burden him, knowing how much he already had on his plate. The doctors ran their tests, asked their questions, and prescribed treatments for what they thought was a persistent case of pneumonia. But the antibiotics did little to help. If anything, her symptoms worsened. By summer, Margaret had lost nearly 20 pounds, her once radiant skin now pallid and drawn. Despite her declining health, Margaret tried to maintain a semblance of normalcy. She kept up appearances at church, greeted neighbors with her trademark smile, and reassured friends that she was simply under the weather. But behind closed doors, she struggled to keep her body from betraying her. The smallest tasks, washing dishes, folding laundry, became insurmountable challenges. And through it all, David remained by her side, his care unwavering yet curiously detached. Margaret couldn't quite place it, but something about David's presence felt off. He was attentive, yes, bringing her meals, fluffing her pillows, and sitting with her during her endless hospital visits. But there was a hollowness to his gestures, as though he were following a script rather than acting out of genuine concern. When she caught him staring at her, his eyes didn't hold the worry she expected. Instead, there was something else, something she couldn't name but felt deep in her bones. As Margaret's health spiraled downward, she began to notice other things, small details that sent chills through her already weakened body. David's clothes often carried a faint, sour odor, one that lingered even after multiple washes. He took to locking his office at the funeral home, a habit he had never had before. And then there was the night she found the vial. Margaret had been folding laundry in their bedroom, her hands moving through the motions as her mind wandered. When she reached into the pocket of one of David's shirts, her fingers brushed against something cold and smooth. She pulled it out, a small glass vial filled with a cloudy liquid. The label had been peeled off, leaving behind only a faint residue of glue. When David came home that evening, she asked him about it, her voice laced with curiosity and just a hint of suspicion. His response was quick, almost too quick. He claimed it was a cleaning solution he used at work, something for disinfecting tools. He even managed a half-smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. Margaret nodded, letting the matter drop, but she didn't believe him. Instead, she tucked the vial away in her bedside drawer, the questions it raised too heavy for her frail body to carry. By the fall of 2019, Margaret was spending more time in the hospital than at home. The doctors were baffled. The infection ravaging her body didn't respond to conventional treatments. They tried experimental therapies, consultations with specialists, but nothing worked. Each failed attempt drained her further, her body wasting away as the life she had built with David seemed to crumble around her. Through it all, Margaret couldn't shake the feeling that her illness wasn't a coincidence. The timing was too precise, too strange. The little signs she had noticed, David's late nights, the vial, the peculiar smells, they swirled in her mind, forming a picture she didn't want to see. She began keeping a journal, writing down everything she observed. It was her way of making sense of the chaos, of leaving behind a record in case she wasn't there to tell the story herself. On the night of February 11, 2020, Margaret's fever spiked to a dangerous level. Her breathing became shallow, her pulse weak. David was there, holding her hand, his face a mask of quiet grief. She tried to speak, to ask him one last time if there was something he wasn't telling her. But the words wouldn't come. Her body gave out before she could summon the strength. Margaret Walker died in the early hours of February 12, 2020. The doctors called it a tragic, unexplained infection. Her death certificate listed complications from bacterial sepsis as the cause. But for those who truly knew Margaret, her passing was anything but simple. It was a mystery wrapped in silence, one that would soon unravel in the most horrifying of ways. The evening of February 15, 2020, started like so many others at Walker Funeral Home. The building, nestled at the edge of Ridgefield, was cloaked in silence, the faint hum of fluorescent lights the only sound cutting through the stillness. Inside, David Walker prepared for what he assumed would be another uneventful night. A new body had been brought in earlier, a young woman who had succumbed to a sudden heart attack. Her family had entrusted David to handle the arrangements, and he approached the task with his usual composure. But tonight would be different. Tonight, the carefully constructed walls of David's secret world would begin to crumble. Aaron, the part-time employee who had started working at the funeral home only a few months prior, had agreed to stay late to assist. Aaron was a quiet young man, eager to learn and always respectful of David's authority. He had admired the older man's professionalism, his ability to remain steady in the face of grief and death. Yet there was something about David that made Aaron uneasy, though he couldn't quite put his finger on it. As the hours passed, Aaron busied himself with routine tasks, organizing paperwork, cleaning tools, and ensuring the embalming room was prepared. David worked in silence, his focus unbroken as he attended to the body on the steel table before him. At first, Aaron thought nothing of his employer's quiet demeanor. It was, after all, part of the job. But as the evening wore on, David's behavior began to shift. Aaron noticed the way David lingered over the body, his movements slow and deliberate in a way that felt unnatural. He muttered to himself under his breath, words Aaron couldn't quite make out. When David thought he was alone, his expression changed. The stoic mask he wore so well slipped, revealing something darker, an intensity that made Aaron's skin crawl. Feeling uneasy, Aaron stepped out of the room, telling himself he was imagining things. He grabbed a cup of coffee from the break room, his hands trembling as he poured. But the nagging feeling in his gut refused to quiet. Something was wrong. He decided to return, to see if he could shake the unsettling thoughts clouding his mind. As Aaron approached the embalming room, he stopped short just outside the door. It was cracked open, and through the narrow gap, he saw David. What he witnessed froze him in place. David was leaning over the body, his hands trembling as he touched the lifeless form in a way that was deeply disturbing, grotesquely intimate. Aaron's breath caught in his throat as the realization of what he was seeing slammed into him. For a moment, Aaron didn't know what to do. His mind raced with questions, each more horrifying than the last. Was this the first time? How long had this been going on? And what kind of man had he been working for all these months? His instinct was to confront David, to demand an explanation. But fear held him back. David, with his calm authority and measured tone, had always seemed unshakable. Now, that same steadiness felt terrifying. What would David do if he realized he'd been caught? Would he turn on Aaron? Would he threaten him? Quietly, Aaron backed away from the door, his heart pounding in his chest. He grabbed his coat and slipped out of the building, the cold night air hitting him like a slap. His hands were shaking so badly he could barely unlock his car. He sat behind the wheel for what felt like an eternity, trying to steady his breathing. The image of what he had seen burned in his mind, impossible to erase. When Aaron finally drove away, he knew he couldn't stay silent. As much as he feared what David might do, the thought of allowing this to continue was unbearable. The next morning, Aaron walked into the Ridgefield Police Department, his face pale and his voice shaking as he recounted the events of the previous night. The officers listened in stunned silence as he described what he had seen, their disbelief quickly replaced by grim determination. Aaron's report was the spark that ignited the fire. Within hours, the police had secured a warrant to search the funeral home. David Walker, the man Ridgefield had trusted with their most vulnerable moments, had no idea that his world was about to collapse. The events of that night would mark the beginning of the end, not just for David, but for the entire town of Ridgefield. The secret he had hidden for so long was about to be laid bare, and the truth would leave scars that no one would soon forget. The morning of February 17, 2020, dawned cold and gray, the kind of day Ridgefield had grown used to during its long, dreary winters. But within the walls of the Ridgefield Police Department, the atmosphere was anything but typical. Aaron's chilling report had set off a flurry of activity. The officers, initially skeptical of his claims, couldn't ignore the raw fear in his eyes as he described what he had witnessed at Walker Funeral Home. By mid-morning, Detective Catherine Hale, a seasoned investigator known for her sharp instincts, was leading the case. Catherine had seen her share of grim discoveries during her career, but this was different. The thought of David Walker, the town's trusted undertaker, being capable of such depravity sent a shiver down her spine. There was no room for error. If Aaron's account was true, it meant the man who had been entrusted with the care of the dead had betrayed that trust in the most horrifying way imaginable. With a search warrant in hand, Catherine and her team arrived discreetly at Walker Funeral Home. The goal was to avoid alarming the townspeople until they had solid evidence. The funeral home's somber exterior gave no hint of the horrors they were about to uncover. The officers entered cautiously, the air inside thick with the faint, sterile scent of formaldehyde. Catherine's eyes scanned the room, taking in every detail, every possible clue. The embalming room was their first stop. On the surface, it appeared clean and orderly, just as one would expect from a professional establishment. But as Catherine's team began their search, the cracks in David's meticulous facade began to show. In a locked cabinet beneath the embalming table, they found a collection of small, unmarked vials. The contents were sent for analysis, but even without confirmation, Catherine felt a knot of dread tightening in her stomach. The real discovery came in the basement. At first glance, the basement seemed to serve as a storage area, filled with boxes of supplies and old equipment. But behind a set of heavy steel shelves, Catherine's team discovered a hidden door. The lock was sturdy, but it wasn't enough to keep them out. When the door swung open, the air inside was colder, heavier, as if the room itself held its breath. What they found inside was beyond anything they had anticipated. The room was small and dimly lit, its walls lined with shelves containing labeled folders, photographs, and handwritten notes. The folders detailed every step of David's gruesome activities, complete with dates, times, and the names of the deceased. Each photograph told a story of violation, each note a chilling reminder of how methodical he had been. Catherine's breath caught as she flipped through one of the folders. It wasn't just the grotesque nature of the evidence that struck her, it was the precision. David hadn't simply acted on impulse, he had planned, documented, and, in some twisted way, rationalized his actions. The meticulousness of his record spoke to a man who believed he would never be caught. As forensic analysts worked to catalog the evidence, another team began reviewing Margaret Walker's medical records. The bacterial infection that had baffled her doctors now took on a horrifying new context. Samples taken from the embalming room and basement revealed traces of the same bacteria that had ravaged Margaret's body. It was clear, her illness was no coincidence. David's secret life had not only desecrated the dead but had also seeped into his home, ultimately claiming the life of his own wife. By the evening of February 17, the evidence was overwhelming. Catherine knew they had enough to bring David in for questioning, but the gravity of the case demanded careful handling. The officers returned to the funeral home that night, this time not in silence but with the full weight of the law behind them. David was calm when they arrived, his face unreadable as they placed him under arrest. He didn't resist, didn't ask why. He simply nodded, as though he had been expecting this moment all along. Back at the station, Catherine sat across from David in the interrogation room. She studied him carefully, noting the way his hands rested motionless on the table, his expression eerily composed. When she began laying out the evidence, his composure faltered for only a fraction of a second, a flicker of something in his eyes, too fleeting to name. "I don't know what you think you found," David said, his voice steady but devoid of emotion. "But I've done nothing wrong." Catherine didn't respond immediately. Instead, she placed one of the folders in front of him, flipping it open to reveal a photograph. David's eyes darted to the image before quickly looking away. It was the first crack in his armor, and Catherine intended to exploit it. "You documented everything," she said, her tone firm but controlled. "Why, David? Why go to such lengths?" For a moment, it seemed as though he might answer, but then his gaze hardened, his lips pressing into a thin line. Whatever battle was raging inside him, he wasn't ready to let it spill out. Not yet. As the night wore on, the full scope of David Walker's secret life began to take shape. The evidence left no room for doubt, and the man Ridgefield had trusted for decades was finally being unmasked. For the families who had placed their loved ones in his care, the betrayal was unimaginable. For Margaret, the truth about her illness was a posthumous revelation that would haunt the town forever. But for Catherine Hale, the case was far from over. Each piece of evidence uncovered only led to more questions, and she was determined to find the answers, even if it meant confronting the depths of human depravity. By April 2020, Ridgefield had become a town defined by whispers and shadows. David Walker's arrest had ripped apart the quiet community, leaving its residents grappling with the unthinkable. The funeral home, once a place of dignity and solace, was now the epicenter of scandal. Families who had trusted David with their loved ones found themselves questioning every detail, wondering if their own relatives had been victims of his unspeakable acts. The trial of David Walker began on April 15, 2020, in the Ridgefield County Courthouse. The courtroom was packed, the air heavy with anticipation and unease. Reporters lined the back walls, their pens poised to capture every grim detail, every shocking revelation. At the center of it all sat David, his expression as unreadable as ever. He was dressed neatly in a gray suit, his hands folded in his lap, a picture of composure. But his stillness was unnerving, almost as if he were detached from the gravity of the accusations leveled against him. The prosecution wasted no time laying out their case. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Duvall painted a chilling picture of a man who had lived a double life for years, exploiting his position to indulge in twisted compulsions. She presented the evidence methodically, piece by piece, the meticulous records found in the basement, the photographs, the notes, and the bacteria samples that tied David's actions directly to the death of his wife, Margaret Walker. When Rachel held up a folder from David's collection and described its contents, a detailed account of his actions with the deceased, gasps rippled through the courtroom. It wasn't just the depravity of his crimes that shocked the onlookers, it was the cold precision with which he had documented them. Each entry had been labeled with dates, times, and names, as if David had been cataloging his crimes for posterity. The most damning piece of evidence came from the testimony of Aaron, the part-time employee who had uncovered the truth. Aaron sat stiffly in the witness chair, his voice trembling as he recounted the events of February 15. He described what he had seen, his horror palpable as he relived the moment. The courtroom was silent, every word falling like a hammer. When Aaron finished, he looked directly at David, his face pale but resolute. David, for his part, didn't react. His gaze remained fixed on the table before him, his expression unflinching. The defense attempted to shift the narrative, arguing that David's actions were the result of an uncontrollable psychological disorder. They brought in a forensic psychologist, who testified that David suffered from a rare form of necrophilic compulsion, driven by deep-seated trauma. The psychologist described how this disorder could warp a person's sense of morality and judgment, turning them into someone unrecognizable even to themselves. But if the defense had hoped to garner sympathy for David, their strategy backfired. The townspeople who filled the courtroom each day weren't interested in explanations or diagnoses. To them, David's role as an undertaker, the very position that required the utmost respect for the deceased, meant that he bore an even greater responsibility. His betrayal was unforgivable, and no amount of psychological analysis could change that. The trial's most dramatic moment came when the prosecution introduced a new piece of evidence, Margaret Walker's journal. Found tucked away in her nightstand during the investigation, the journal contained entries that Margaret had written during the final months of her life. Her words painted a heartbreaking picture of a woman torn between love and suspicion, between devotion to her husband and fear of the secrets he might be hiding. In one of the final entries, Margaret wrote, "I feel like I'm living with a stranger. David has become someone I don't recognize, and I'm too scared to confront him. But if something happens to me, I hope someone will read this and know that I tried to understand. I tried to help him. I just couldn't reach him." The journal was the final nail in the coffin. It revealed not only Margaret's growing awareness of David's darkness but also her own tragic sense of helplessness. The courtroom fell silent as the judge instructed the jury to deliberate, the weight of Margaret's words lingering in the air. It didn't take long for the jury to reach a verdict. On July 10, 2020, David Walker was found guilty on all charges, including abuse of a corpse, desecration of the dead, and involuntary manslaughter for the role his actions had played in Margaret's death. He was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. As the judge read the sentence, David remained silent, his expression unchanged. But for the people of Ridgefield, the moment was anything but quiet. It was a collective exhale, a release of months of tension and anguish. Justice had been served, but the scars left by David's actions would linger for years to come. The trial answered many questions, but it also left a chilling reminder: evil often wears a familiar face. For Ridgefield, the man they had trusted most had become the symbol of their greatest betrayal. And for Margaret, justice came too late to save her, but her courage in leaving behind her words ensured that her story, and the truth, would never be forgotten. Ridgefield was never the same after David Walker's conviction. The quiet town, once defined by its close-knit community and tranquil streets, now bore the weight of a collective wound. The Walker Funeral Home, a pillar of trust and tradition for decades, stood abandoned, its windows boarded up and its front sign hastily removed. The building, once a place of reverence, had become a grim reminder of the darkness that had festered behind its walls. For the families who had entrusted their loved ones to David's care, the betrayal was unimaginable. Some began to question whether their relatives had also fallen victim to his twisted desires. The thought was too painful for many to entertain, but the uncertainty lingered like a shadow. The local authorities were inundated with requests to re-examine cases involving bodies that had passed through the funeral home. Investigations were opened, but the results were inconclusive, leaving many families with no closure. Margaret Walker's story, too, became a point of deep sorrow for the town. Her journal entries, read aloud during the trial, revealed a woman who had lived in the grip of quiet desperation. She had loved her husband, even as she suspected he was hiding something terrible. Her death, once thought to be a tragic medical mystery, was now understood to be a horrifying consequence of David's actions. Margaret had been both a victim and a witness, trapped in a house of secrets she couldn't escape. In the months following the trial, the people of Ridgefield grappled with the profound sense of betrayal. How could someone as respected as David have hidden such darkness for so long? How could the town have been so blind? These questions echoed in church pews, at neighborhood gatherings, and in hushed conversations in the local diner. Trust, once the foundation of their community, had been irreparably shaken. The local funeral industry suffered as well. Other funeral homes in the area, though unaffiliated with David, found themselves under scrutiny. Families were hesitant to place their trust in anyone handling their loved ones, and some chose to conduct private burials instead. It would take years for the industry to recover, and even then, the specter of David Walker's crimes would linger. For Detective Catherine Hale, the case was both a professional milestone and a personal burden. While she took pride in uncovering the truth and bringing David to justice, the horrors she had uncovered left a lasting mark. She often revisited Margaret's journal, haunted by the woman's words and the knowledge that her death might have been preventable if someone had seen the signs earlier. But amidst the darkness, the case also served as a harsh but necessary lesson for Ridgefield, and beyond. The town began to confront uncomfortable truths about the nature of evil and the danger of blind trust. Community leaders organized workshops and talks about recognizing signs of manipulation and abuse, not just in personal relationships but in professional ones as well. Psychologists and grief counselors were brought in to help families process their anger and grief, and Margaret's name became a symbol of courage and the need to speak out. Margaret's journal, published posthumously with the consent of her family, became a poignant reminder of the power of observation and the cost of silence. Her entries, raw and heartfelt, resonated with readers across the country. She became a voice for those who had ever felt trapped in doubt and fear, urging them to trust their instincts and seek the truth, no matter how painful it might be. In the years that followed, Ridgefield slowly began to heal, though the scars remained. The funeral home was eventually sold and converted into a community center, its new purpose serving as a symbol of resilience and rebirth. The townspeople learned to trust again, though with more caution and vigilance than before. David Walker, now serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole, faded from public memory, his name spoken only in hushed tones. His crimes became a cautionary tale, a reminder that darkness can lurk in the most unexpected places. But Margaret's story endured, her courage lighting a path for those who needed it most. The aftermath of David Walker's crimes left Ridgefield forever changed. But from the ruins of betrayal and despair, the town found a way to rebuild, not by forgetting the past, but by learning from it. It was a painful process, but one that ultimately reinforced a hard-earned truth: even in the face of unimaginable darkness, there is a way forward. And sometimes, the strength to move forward begins with the courage to confront what lies hidden in the shadows. The echoes of David Walker's crimes continued to ripple through Ridgefield long after his sentencing. The once quiet town was now marked by its dark chapter, a cautionary tale whispered among neighbors and retold in true crime circles across the country. Though justice had been served, the weight of what had transpired lingered like a shadow that no amount of time could completely erase. The Walker Funeral Home, now converted into a bustling community center, stood as both a reminder and a beacon of resilience. Where once David had conducted his twisted acts in secrecy, children now played in brightly lit rooms, and community meetings were held to bring people together. But even as life moved on, the building carried a heavy legacy, an ever-present symbol of the darkness that had hidden in plain sight. Inside the prison walls where David Walker would spend the rest of his life, silence reigned. He rarely spoke to anyone, his days spent in quiet contemplation or, perhaps, in avoidance of the horrors he had left behind. To the world outside, he had become a ghost, his name relegated to the annals of Ridgefield's history. Yet questions about his motives and the full extent of his crimes persisted. Had he ever felt remorse? Were there other victims, other secrets yet uncovered? These questions would likely never be answered, locked away in the mind of a man who had chosen silence as his final defense. Margaret's journal, published posthumously, became a national sensation. It gave a voice to her pain and suspicions, resonating with countless readers who saw echoes of their own struggles in her words. Her courage to document her fears, even as her health deteriorated, inspired many to confront the truths they had been too afraid to face. She became a symbol, not just of the tragedy that had befallen Ridgefield, but of the strength it took to speak out against the unknown. For Ridgefield, the lessons of the Walker case became a rallying cry for vigilance and community awareness. Workshops were held to educate residents on recognizing signs of manipulation and abuse. A scholarship was even created in Margaret's name, aimed at supporting students pursuing careers in psychology and forensic science, ensuring her story would leave a lasting impact on future generations. But even as the town worked to rebuild, some questions refused to go away. How had someone like David, so well respected and deeply trusted, managed to hide his darkness for so long? Were there others like him, lurking in other towns, leading other seemingly ordinary lives? And perhaps most haunting of all, had Margaret suspected more than she let on? Did she know the full extent of her husband's secrets before her death? As life in Ridgefield slowly resumed its rhythm, the town found a way to balance remembrance with progress. The story of David Walker became less about the man himself and more about the lessons his actions left behind, that darkness can thrive in silence, that trust must be tempered with awareness, and that even in the face of betrayal, a community can rebuild itself stronger than before. But some wounds, even as they fade, leave scars that can't be ignored. Every so often, as Ridgefield residents passed the former funeral home or sat in the church where Margaret had once sung in the choir, they would feel a chill, a fleeting reminder of what had been lost, and of the secrets that might still lie hidden in other quiet places. What do you think about this haunting story? Do you believe Margaret suspected more than she wrote in her journal? Could someone like David Walker truly hide such darkness without anyone noticing for so long? We want to hear your thoughts. Share your opinions in the comments below. How would you have acted if you were in Margaret's or Aaron's position? Do you think justice was served, or does this story leave you with more questions than answers? Let us know, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on more stories that dive into the shadows of human nature. Together, let's uncover the truths hidden in the darkness.